Tēnā koutou katoa. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I would like to thank my nominators, Professor Wendy Lana, Charlotte MacDonald, the late Angus Hikaru McFarlane, Paul Miller, and my referees. I've had the privilege of learning from and working with many excellent scholars and students in the wonderful world of academia. I think the social sciences and humanities are as much a collective endeavour as the sciences. That often gets overlooked, I think, but it's always together. And my field of expertise is broadly feminist and post-colonial history, interconnecting fields including gender and empire, commemoration, and decolonisation. My work involves the local, Ōtautahi Christchurch and Canterbury, National Aotearoa New Zealand and transnational Canadian, Australian and British past. I've published on Aotearoa New Zealand women's stories, and I've published on advancing the historiography of Aotearoa New Zealand. The status of women in society and the construction of the settler colonial past are my overarching preoccupations. My work has argued that in the construction of the settler past, that is, places such as Aotearoa New Zealand, Canada, Australia, where migrants from a British imperial centre come to dominate and govern, establishing colonies that go on to become nations in their own right, devolve from the imperial centre, colonisation depended as much on the work of women as it did on those who we usually think are the imperialists and nation makers. It's inaccurate to focus solely on the male colonial officials and politicians who worked in public agencies. Power and knowledge in the past worked in much more complex ways. The phrase, "the hand that rocked the cradle rules the world," captures this sentiment and evokes the essence of mid-19th century ideology concerning the place of women. Born in Kentucky to a Presbyterian minister of Scotch descent, William Ross Wallace in the mid-19th century published a poem as part of a collection. Blessing, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Blessing on the hands of women, just a taste. Angels guard its strength and grace. Oh, in the palace, cottage, hovel. Oh, no matter where the place. Would that never storms assailed it, rainbows ever gently curled, for the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. Women, how divine your mission here upon our natal sod. Keep, oh keep the young heart open, always to the breath of God. All true trophies of the ages are from mother love impearled, for the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rocks the world. Now, by the time that I was at university in the mid-1980s, there was a rich literature on the cult of domesticity, public and private spheres, the valorization of women as angels in the home. The public and private spheres became a very important framework for historians seeking the other half of history because of evidence such as captured in Wallace's poem of an ideological division between the public, the domain of trade, commerce, men, nation building and the outdoors, and the private space, which was occupied by women, domesticity, the indoors and the fireplace. But for feminist scholars seeking to rethink the whole of history, the limits of such maternal rhetoric and the division of the past into two spheres was questioned for the extent to which it did not represent the reality of many bridges between the spheres, how it was artificial and too overgeneralised, an explanation for scholars to employ, and it was too celebratory, casting all women as angels, and it missed race and class differences, and it missed the role of fathers and wider constructions of family. So launching off from this perspective, my work has argued that if we want to understand imperialism, nation-making and the construction of the settler colonial past, it is essential to include the work of women as agents of empire and the makers of nation, no matter how awkward it might be. And I have argued that rather turn away from rocking the cradles, however, women's part as colonisers was predicated on a maternal standpoint, as expressed in Wallace's poem. And whether conservative or radical, a maternal position was most often women's platform to rule the world. Aotearoa New Zealand's world-leading first in women's suffrage, led by Kate Shepherd, was grounded in ideas of women's maternal civilising influence. More generally, it was mothers' place to assist immigrants with the provision of home comforts and motherly care, to protect women and girls through hostels, to contribute as nurses and doctors and members of hospital boards, as missionary wives and members of religious orders, as teachers, writers, educationalists, members of hospital boards, and as members of imperial propaganda clubs. So it was extensive. Through multiple research projects, I have come up with an overall framework. Clicker. It ain't working. Yep, we've got a malfunction.
Can we do it manually?
Here we go, we got it. I'll try it when it comes to slide. So I've come up with an overall framework for the composition of settler colonialism, which features the superiority of Britishness in the past, British democracy and constitutional monarchy, privileges, Christian saintly myths and of the British Isles, economic and cultural progress through new innovations and technologies, unquestioned conquest and colonisation of Indigenous people, the assimilation of all difference. It was, of course, always contested, as hegemonic identities are, and constructed in opposition to the difference that it attempted to assimilate. So it's most clearly articulated in times of war, patriotism, there's been a great way I've tried to prove it, or perceived threats to dominance, such as immigration. In particular, I have argued that the British Empire's largest women's patriotic organisation was a forgotten coloniser and a vital part of imperial history. Gendered work in education, health, welfare and citizenship all promoted settler colonialism, and I've argued that women, not men, actually led the way. In order to find out more about how the British cultural hegemony worked and its relationship with settler colonial nationalism, I turn to the death and commemoration of Edith Cavell. Cavell was the most famous British woman of the First World War, executed on the 12th of October in 1915 by the occupying Germans in Brussels for escorting troops to the enemy, or resistance worker she was. Allied soldiers and would-be soldier Europeans seeking to get up to neutral Holland and then to cross back to Britain and then to come and join the war effort again. Based on extensive transnational research, I interrogate the construction of white British womanhood and women's difference versus equality in society, arguing for gender as central to war and commemoration. I located and mapped a large number of monuments in the landscape, arguing that complex imperial, national and civic identities formed across metropolitan and colonial divide. Such Cavellscapes could be spontaneous and local, such as the naming of the Edith Cavell Bridge, which was over the Shotover River in Queenstown. An old miner simply decided that the second bridge over the Shotover was not a good enough name for it, and it should be renamed after Cavell, and he just kept painting it on the rock until eventually it became official. Now, a feature of settler colonialism was that the heroes and heroines of Britain became what we might call imperial signifiers, or colonial baggage, with the celebrated white women to be emulated restrictively cast as either superwomanly or honorary men. The complex history of such cultural imperialism can be read in heroic storytelling. Such storytelling could be embodied, with female imperialists taking on the mantle of the mother of empire, Queen Victoria herself. If you think some things never change, the mantle continues on. This is Oamaru in the early 21st century. And here, this is Josette Work in Victoria, British Columbia, who was a Métis woman who married a Hudson's Bay Company official and became very much a part of the matronly elite of British Columbia. The relationship between Indigenous women and settler women is of great importance in my work. Women are complexly both colonisers and colonised. Ironically, believing herself that hereditary exception made her the exception to the rule, and that women should remain in the private sphere, Queen Victoria sought to check what she called the mad, wicked folly of women's rights. Importantly, while the Queen was against feminist intentions, and conservative women who took on her mantle were responsible for many feminist outcomes. So I think it's complexified that way, intention and outcome. In the Ashburton Domain in 1910, an appropriately British beech tree was planted upon Florence Nightingale's death. The Mayoress, Lady Henry Davis, planted the tree with school children, and they're assembled. You can see from the monument here, from the poem of Tennyson, a lady with a lamp shall stand in the great history of the land. Remember, this is Ashburton. A noble life of good, heroic womanhood. So Nightingale was naturalised in the landscape. It's an act of ecological imperialism, we would call it, with her monument, that's in the middle, resembling a tombstone. That's her tombstone on the left. Meanwhile, Jamaican-born Mary Seacole, also a leading health reformer in the Crimea at the time, was not claimed, and her story was told in relation to that of Florence Nightingale. nightingale as the imperial signifier. My work is extended to the construction and the meaning of global heroines in history, developed during a James Cook Fellowship, responding to Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces and influenced by Carl Jung's work on archetypes, recognising there are always local and individual agency. I explore the idea of modern transcultural heroic archetype. My work advances a new genre in feminist history, evident through the chapters in my book: mothers, warriors, callings, cross-dressing, death and disability, feminist icons and role models, glamour, plastic body parts, celebrity mothers, perspex cages, and a new Joan of Arc, who's Greta Thunberg. Overall, what we consider as heroic for everybody is deeply and restrictively transmitted from the past. The devastating earthquakes in February 2011 led me to apply ideas of the settler colonial past to a ruptured colonial Christchurch. In Christchurch, the earth moved statues. And before elsewhere, you see Edward Colston on your right, that's 2020, on your left is Robert Godley, 2011. Advancing new ideas about decolonisation, my work examined the relationship between landscape, hegemony and culture to identify 5 major ruptures resulting from the Canterbury earthquakes. I argue that the earthquakes created a definitive endpoint to Christchurch's colonial history, a moment of decolonisation, that there was a natural break from the colonial past in 2011. I hope my work contributed to the new decolonising city, evidenced in the landscape post-quake. Here you see one of the welcome mates, Whauriki, and Robert Falcon Scott, imperial explorer of the heroic age, as companions in the landscape. And here in Victoria Square, one of 2 upright waka complements the Queen Victoria statue to strengthen the relationship between Ngāi Tahu and the Crown. Well, in January 2017, women's marches broke out around the globe in support of gender equality and civil rights. But with echoes of Wallace's poem, these protesters marching here, they're in Bristol, Edward, continuity with Colston, are marching with their baby buggy cradles, as you can see there, holding up a sign, "Who runs the world?" with the answer, according to Beyonce's 2011 song, being girls. And as for Queen Victoria and the mad, wicked folly of women's rights, in 1971, second-wave feminists, led by Sue Kedgley here and Ahuia Te Awe Kautuku, carried a coffin to the statue of Queen Victoria in Albert Square, protesting the lack of progress in women's liberation. Queen Victoria was a symbolic part of the problem. How ironic then, you can see on the right, that by 2017, the local women's march in Otautahi started at the Queen Victoria statue. On that day, my daughter Clara and I found ourselves standing in the decolonising square beside the heroic era statue, reflecting on our city's radical past, its feminist heritage, and reading out words against disability discrimination. My research passions at that moment collided and materialised, sweeping us up in the moment. Today we're here and we thank the Royal Society Te Aparangi very much for the honour. Kia ora.
Thanks, Katie. Another wonderful talk. God, haven't we had a rich, diverse mix of talks? Yeah, it's that's one of the great things about these new Fellows Days is we get to hear from disciplines we wouldn't always hear from. So, questions. I know you've sat down, Katie.
I ran away.
But you get to go. I know you went on.
Yeah,
but it was
used my time.
Gold.
Yeah.
So let's have one question from the back there, Cather. Oh yeah, got it.
Thanks. I've been trying to figure out how to phrase this question. So I have a colleague in the States who says that we'll know we've reached equality when mediocre women succeed at the same rate as mediocre men. And your entire presentation was about heroes, male and female. Can you comment on that? Is that a valid thing, or do we have to have some sort of equality in our heroes, or how do you think about what the end point of all of this is?
What it comes down to is that as long as we have a feminine suffix, so hero in, I-N-E, on the end, and the gendering, and we gender heteronormatized, all sorts of what we consider to be heroic, there will be no progress. I mean, what my research showed is that, there's a lot, isn't there, about, oh, this is wonderful, this is heroic, this is the future, this is where we're going. And what my research is about is that usually just reproduces a lot of ideas from the past that have had their day.